Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Andrey Kozik. He's the International Committee of the Red Cross Legal Coordinator for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He is in Armenia for the 12th International Conference for Young Researchers on International Humanitarian Law. This year we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the conventions, Geneva Conventions, which are the main theme of this year's conference. Welcome, Mr. Kozik.
Thank you.
So most of the people don't know exactly what the conventions, the Geneva Conventions are. Could you please explain to us exactly what it is about?
Yeah, with pleasure. So, 150 years ago, about in 1863, 5 people in Geneva initiated a new, actually private initiative to gather in a society, in an association, and to promote quite an obvious for today thing, a thought that probably all those who assist on battlefields, who treat wounded and ill, should be neutral by status. And they initiated an international conference that led to adoption of the very first historical Geneva Convention in 1864. After that, this idea evolved a lot, and actually at this moment we have 4 Geneva Conventions adopted 70 years ago. And these 4 Geneva Conventions approach different issues, like dealing with wounded, sick, dealing with civilian population, dealing with prisoners of war. These conventions were supplemented with 2 protocols in 1977, and then another one, the third additional protocol in 2005. Geneva Conventions is a core of so-called international humanitarian law, which deals with situations of armed conflicts and situations when states deal with non-state actors. And thus they are very important, as we still have a lot of situations of violence in the world. Geneva Conventions at this moment are well respected by states, by parties to the conflict, and thanks to these interesting instruments we have a lot of discussions on the high level on many issues, not only victims of war and their statuses and making their life better, but also discussion on means and methods of war. Despite Geneva Conventions do not regulate this implicitly, but international humanitarian law deals with means and methods. And as we see, actually today we have a lot of development in this field. So Geneva Conventions as a core element of international humanitarian law are still very important today.
The 3 main pillars of the humanitarian law are the principles of distinctions, proportionality, and precaution. And if any of those principles are violated, then war crime, the humanitarian law considers there is a war crime committed, right? But how do you decide that in a context of war? Once you have decided that a war crime happened, what are the next steps? How do you decide that it has been committed? What are the consequences for the countries who are that are party of the convention? What happened to them?
The first thing that we all should understand is that Geneva Conventions are international treaties. International treaty means a treaty that is designed by states, for themselves. So states do not take obligations that they are not ready to take upon themselves. We all would like to have better society probably, and better international community. But we have what we have. And Geneva Conventions never had an objective to protect everyone from the consequences of armed conflicts. Unfortunately, it's not a shield that could protect with 100% probability each and every civilian, child, mother, all the people. So that's an issue that we always should understand. It's a mechanism that has been developed by states for themselves. So one of the important elements of this mechanism is fighting against impunity, is fighting against war crimes. And this specific mechanism is rather young as well. Let's say before 1945, there was no mechanism of repression of war criminals. Nuremberg Nuremberg trial was the very first example when high officials of a state were convicted, were trialed actually, on the basis including the war crimes. So that's why Geneva Conventions are important, because they have a special notion in themselves as grave breaches of international humanitarian law, grave breaches of Geneva Conventions. Those which are called today war crimes. And definitely fighting impunity is a very important element of any law actually. But if we take into account the mandate of the ICRC, its first objective is to assist victims of war, is to make their future better to the extent possible. And this mission of the ICRC has been given to it by states in Geneva Conventions. ICRC is a very rare example of an international organization which has a special mandate given by states in international treaties. Fighting impunity is an obligation of states. Fighting war crimes is an obligation of states. So states took upon themselves an obligation to investigate, find, trial, convict, and execute the sentences of those people. Development of IHL led to so-called principle of universal jurisdiction, which actually impose even more important obligations over states. Now states are obliged to investigate and to punish war crimes not only committed by their citizens or on their territory, but actually committed worldwide. War crimes do not have statutory limitations, which means whenever it took place, it could be prosecuted. And we have examples when war criminals that committed acts during the Second World War, now this, I mean, in our, we could witness that. I mean, the last case like this happened like a couple of years ago, when they're discovered, they found, sentenced, and finally they execute the trial, the sentence. So that's why, I mean, this war crime issue is very important, but again, that's an obligation of states to deal with that. Regarding your question, yes, the three principles of international humanitarian law are very important. But the idea of the ICRC and its mandate is to be impartial, independent, and neutral, which gives a very interesting benefit to the ICRC to serve in interest of victims, regardless of on which side they are. I mean, under control of which party to the conflict they are. Because victims, well, they do not participate in the conflicts. They are out of the battle, they are civilians or wounded. So, but what is important here? ICRC has this unique opportunity, being confidential, impartial, not neutral, to serve in the best interests of these groups of people. Fighting impunity, fighting war crimes, again, is a very important thing. What happens if a state doesn't want to fight impunity, doesn't want to investigate war crimes? Again, we have nothing special here which differ international humanitarian law from other fields of international law. States enforce regimes, enforce the rules of international treaties themselves. So usually states push other states on this way of fulfillment of obligation they have taken on their shoulders. Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions says states should respect and ensure respect of Geneva Conventions, which means they have obligation not only respect by themselves, but also deal with other subjects of international law, motivating them, at least motivating or ensuring that they fulfill their obligations under the Geneva Conventions. And this phrase, to respect and to ensure respect, is a phrase that is number of times repeated in many international instruments, including United Nations General Assembly Declaration, Security Council declarations, resolutions of international conferences of Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, etc., etc., etc. So again, that's an obligation that is imposed on the shoulders of states at the first basis. And from this perspective, if a state doesn't want to fight against the war crimes committed, well, it faces the responsibility again under international law. Unfortunately, there is no mechanism like a police, international police, that could force a state to do something if other states do not support this. So that's how international law works. It's not about the ICRC, it's not about me or you. That's the way states designed the system. And until they would like to change something, nothing will be changed. But if we will look at the way IHL is respected, I could say that in 99% of cases, IHL is well respected. In 99% of cases, we see that victims of war get better treatment. Yeah, we have a lot of problems with armed conflicts, but armed conflict is not an easy stuff. That's true that not everything is solved, but we have really better situation with them, better situation with the victims as we had during the Second World War. That's obvious, right? When we talk about the Second World War, we say, oh, that was a horrible thing. And what that was, war is a horrible thing by itself. But if we compare nowadays conflicts with those ones, we could see the difference. And that's also because of the IHL, and because it is implemented, and states would like to go in this way. But the problem is that, unfortunately, if you have a rule, sometimes the rule could be not respected well. And that's what we see all over the world. And that's why we have international tribunals established. That's why we have International Criminal Court in The Hague established. That's why states try to implement mechanisms that would help assist them to fight impunity. That's why it's important. So the situation is really complicated. It's not that easy. I don't have an easy answer to this, but it's evolving.
Mm-hmm. Also, you talked about the Second World War and the changes after this, because the convention was created in 1949, so right after, few years after the Second World War. And since that moment, war also evolved, as you said. It's changed even the way we manage wars and how the perception we have on wars, and thanks to the convention and everything. But now we see also new phenomena, right? For example, if wars used to be in the battlefield, for example, a neutral place where the people are fighting against each other, now it has changed. The battlefield became urbanized more, it happens in the cities, there are new means of warfare. So what are those new means of warfare, and how the humanitarian law face them, and what does the humanitarian law suggest?
Thank you, very good question. That's true that international humanitarian law doesn't have an objective to stop developing of means or methods of war. But it has a very interesting mechanism which is enshrined in Article 36 of the first additional protocol to Geneva Conventions. This mechanism obliges states to revise any new means and methods of war and to consider whether these new means and methods are in conformity with their obligations under international humanitarian law. That's a very important mechanism because states, whatever they develop, should always take care about whether these new means and methods could be applied with respect to Geneva Conventions, protocols, and other obligations under IHL. So that's one important thing here. Another one is that it is true that states are trying constantly to obtain new means and methods. Well, we could name cyber operations these days, cyber attacks. We could call for autonomous weapon systems that are under development now. Such systems are frightening a little bit because we saw them in a number of movies, and they could engage attacks by themselves without intervention of a human. We have other developments. We have new tactics being developed, including urban warfare. We have the problem of explosive weapons used in urban warfare. And that's also an issue because the consequence of such warfare is one of the consequences is a lot of casualties among civilians. We still have nuclear weapon that doesn't have a universal ban. We still have landmines which significantly reduced in numbers worldwide because of the international community and new conventions we have, but we still have states that use them. We have a lot of issues with new and old weapons actually. So, but cyber and autonomous weapon systems, I guess, are the two main challenges because between states till now there is a discussion whether IHL is applicable to this new means, because when conventions were designed, there were no even a hint that such new types of weapon would exist, would be developed. So, and if IHL is applied, and that's the majority of states consider that it should be applied, but to which extent? Should we apply conventions and protocols the same way as to conventional weapon? Should we consider some other principles taking into account the practice of states? So these are the challenges that lawyers deal with and sometimes fight in Geneva, in the United Nations, in New York, and other forums. We have a lot of international bodies that deal with this. Well, another issue is outer space. I mean, what kind of operations are allowed in outer space? Let's say if one satellite shadows another satellite, cutting it off from the sunlight, which means making it impossible to get the energy from the sun, whether that's an attack or not, whether that's legal or not. So, etc., 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 a lot of issues nowadays. So, but what we see, again, the nature of the conflicts changed. If after the Second World War, the main danger that states considered was on the side of international conflicts, when one state fights against another state. So these days we see that international conflicts are quite rare. We have situations of non-international conflicts or other violence. We have situation when we have migration of millions of people from one place to another, escaping from wars, for example. What to do with all these people? I mean, how to deal with them? All these challenges were not that actual just after the Second World War. And now states have to deal with that. They're constantly trying to get new mechanisms on this. But because usually such negotiations should be concluded with consensus, which is very difficult to get, we need time, and time. It was, to some extent, it was a very, I would say, if not a miracle, but something really close, that we had for Geneva Conventions just 4 years after the Second World War. I mean, states were shocked by the consequences of the war to that extent that they made the conventions in a very, very, very short period, drafted them, and well, put them in force. And I think that's something that is very, very difficult to achieve now, despite we all agree that war is something unusual and something that should not happen. And even if it happens, we should deal with the consequences of that.
If we talk about the conflict in the region, let's talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, which is for some a state, an independent state, for others a region occupied for Azerbaijanis, for Armenians liberated, and so it's a place in between, an enclave inside Azerbaijan, and that is in conflict. And so the convention works also on this conflict. So what is actually, how does the conventions, how do the conventions influence this conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh?
Well, the first thing that is important to note is that, well, Geneva Conventions are the most ratified treaties in the world. We have 196 ratifications, which means that each country in the world is a party to the convention. And this makes convention unique, because even if a party to the conflict is not a party to the convention, to some reasons, Geneva Conventions are considered to be customary rules of law, which means it doesn't matter whether a state is a party to the convention or not, it should respect that. This is referenced not only to the parties which we consider as states, but actually to any party of the conflict. So, first of all, regarding your question, Geneva Conventions are applied to whatever conflicts on the earth we have. The second issue, again, that's always a problematic mechanism, how to ensure the respect of Geneva Conventions, and there is a high discussion in general in the world, to which extent, whether there are any violations of conventions or not. The ICRC works in the region, and it has been presented in the region for a significant period of time, trying to assist victims of the armed conflict. Again, the ICRC is an independent and neutral organization, and this neutrality means that we not deal with political issues, with political aspects of any conflicts, because that would definitely harm our own mandate. We would not be allowed to get access where we need to get access to. We would not be allowed to deal with the issue. So the most important thing for us is to be present and to be able to assist the victims of war according to our mandate. So that's the most important thing, and I hope that the ICRC deals quite well in the region, and well, at least at this moment, we do whatever is feasible and what is in framework of our mandate to deal with the conflict.
The two republics, Azerbaijan and Armenia, are party of the convention, and unilaterally Nagorno-Karabakh also joined the convention. How does this factor impact the implementation of the law in the context of the conflict?
Well, it is important when a party to the conflict consider itself being binded by the convention, by certain obligations. It's important because after this, usually the national implementation mechanisms starting to work, which means that on national basis, the state adopts rules and deliver these rules to military forces, deliver these rules to hospitals, etc., to ensure that the rules in the conventions are respected. Because one thing is to ratify a convention or to join it, and another thing is to ensure that everybody has read it and actually understand how to deal with it. Because, well, that's a significant number of pages to read and to understand. So states need to implement them, and that's very important when a state or a party to the conflict says, okay, we are a party too. we are going to join these obligations. And that's, well, from the point of view of the world community, I think that is very important. And again, this opens discussion inside the state, how to implement these rules better. And that is very important. One of the first questions you asked me was about the war crimes. Without changes in criminal codes, well, fighting impunity would be impossible. But changing the criminal code, putting there, for example, war crimes, saying that there will be no statutory limitations to these crimes, is a part of implementation process. And the very first step of all this process is for a country, for a state, to decide that yes, we are going to fulfill the obligations. So we will change our national legislation to ensure that these conventions are respected. That is very important, because those states, again, referenced into your question, which do not follow the convention or which do not fight the violations of the convention, well, they face consequences. First of all, negative reaction of other states. And this could lead, well, to the consequences we saw many times up to the Security Council measures, United Nations Security Council measures. So states respect. Plus, despite reciprocity is not an issue in IHL, so even if one state violates, it doesn't allow another state to violate reciprocal the convention. Regardless of that, we see that in general, if one state respects Geneva Convention, definitely on another side there is much higher motivation to respect convention. Not only on the state level, sometimes heads of states, they would definitely vote in favor with their two hands to ensure respect of conventions. But people are people, I mean, human are human. And when you see a soldier on the battlefield with all the human emotions, like anger, for example, like revenge, etc., well, it's difficult to implement the conventions. So that's why it is important to understand that implementation of convention is a constant process, from the high level till the level of a soldier, till the level of a medical worker, for example, who deals with wounded and sick, etc., etc., etc. So this is a process, but again, it starts from the states signing, ratifying, or other way, joining the obligations under the convention. So that's very important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kozik. Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.